The moment I walked through those courthouse doors in my dress uniform, my father laughed out loud. Not a chuckle. A real laugh, the kind he used to save for other people's mistakes, never mine. My sister Emily leaned toward the man beside her and said just loud enough for the whole hallway to hear, "Look at her, still playing soldier." I didn't answer. I didn't even turn my head. What none of them knew, what none of them could have possibly known, was that in about 40 minutes, the judge sitting behind that bench was going to look at me and forget for just 1 second that he was supposed to be neutral. My name is Chloe Evans. I'm 33 years old. I hold the rank of Major in the United States Army, and for the last several years I've served in a role most civilians have never heard of: family assistance and legal liaison work. The kind of job where you show up at someone's door in the worst hour of their life, and you don't leave until they can stand on their own again. These days I hold a command position at a major installation. None of that ever mattered to my family. To them, I was the daughter who left. The one who didn't stay close, didn't help with the business, didn't show up for Sunday dinners, because I was stationed somewhere they couldn't be bothered to find on a map. Emily was the one who stayed. Emily was the one who got praised for it every single time, whether she'd earned it or not. I want to explain how we got here because none of this happened overnight, and I think it matters that you understand it wasn't really about money. Not at first. My grandfather was the one person in that family who never made me feel like an afterthought. He was the kind of man who remembered which coffee you drank, who called on your birthday even when he was sick, who used to sit on the porch and tell me stories about his own time in the service, like they were bedtime stories instead of history. When he passed, he left behind a modest but real estate, an old family house, a piece of land that had been in our name for 2 generations, and some investments he'd built slowly, carefully, over a lifetime of not spending money he didn't have. His will was plain. Everything split evenly between his 2 granddaughters. No confusion, no hidden clauses, nothing complicated. Just fair. That's not what happened. In the months after his funeral, while I was still finishing up an overseas rotation, my father quietly began moving things. Accounts, property titles, paperwork that should have gone through probate cleanly instead started routing through lawyers I'd never heard of, banks I didn't recognize. By the time I got back stateside and started asking questions, nearly everything had already landed in Emily's name. When I brought it up calmly at first because I still wanted to believe there was an explanation, my father looked at me like I'd asked him something absurd. "You don't need the money," he said. "You've got your army paycheck." That was the whole answer. 20 years of history reduced to one sentence like my grandfather's wishes were something you could just talk your way around if you said it confidently enough. So I did what I was trained to do. I didn't yell, I didn't threaten. I hired a lawyer, and I asked for the truth to be put on paper where a judge could see it. And that's when the real war started. Because my family didn't apologize. They didn't even deny it outright. Instead, they turned it around on me. They filed a countersuit, and I remember sitting in my lawyer's office reading the accusations for the first time, and actually feeling my stomach drop, not from fear but from something closer to disbelief. They claimed I had pressured my grandfather into signing documents while he was ill. They claimed I had manipulated an elderly man who could no longer think clearly for himself. They even suggested, buried in the fine print of the filing, that a signature on one of the transfer documents didn't look quite right. An insinuation dressed up just enough to avoid saying the word forgery outright, but close enough that everyone in that courtroom would understand exactly what they meant. I remember reading that page twice then, setting it down on the table very slowly, the way you set down something you're afraid you might otherwise throw across the room. They knew I wouldn't do that. I'm not built that way. But I think in some strange fashion they were counting on exactly that. On me staying quiet, staying composed, staying exactly the kind of daughter who doesn't cause scenes. They just never accounted for what composure actually means when you've spent your whole career keeping it under conditions far worse than a family courtroom in October. So there I was, standing in the hallway of a county courthouse in my Army service uniform, my father laughing at me, my sister rolling her eyes like I was an actress overplaying a part. I let them have their moment. I've learned there's no use interrupting people while they're still convinced they're winning. Then the doors to the courtroom opened and we filed inside, and I found my seat at the table across from the two of them. I sat up straight the way you're taught to on day one, back flat, eyes forward, hands folded. A few minutes later, the bailiff called the room to order and the judge walked in. He was an older man, silver-haired, with the kind of face that looks like it has heard every excuse a person can invent and stopped being impressed by any of them years ago. He sat down, opened the folder in front of him, and lifted his eyes to scan the room the way judges do, routine, unbothered, moving on to the next case of the day. Then his eyes reached me, and he stopped. For a second, maybe two, the judge didn't move. He just looked at me the way you look at a photograph you weren't expecting to find in a drawer you'd forgotten about. Then he cleared his throat, glanced back down at his folder like he was reminding himself where he was, and the moment passed so quickly that I doubt anyone else in that room even registered it. Anyone except me. I noticed. I've spent my whole career learning to read faces in rooms where the wrong read could cost someone everything, and I knew exactly what I'd just seen. Recognition. Not the polite kind you give a stranger, the kind that catches you off guard. I didn't let it show. I kept my hands folded on the table and my eyes forward, and I let the case begin the way cases begin, slowly, with lawyers stating names into the record, with the low hum of a room settling into its rhythm. My father was practically glowing with confidence. He'd hired one of the more expensive firms in the county, the kind that keeps 3 associates on hand just to carry the boxes, and Emily sat beside him in a blazer that looked like it had been picked out specifically to read as respectable. They'd built their case around a simple story. I was the daughter who left. I chased a career instead of staying close to family, and now, conveniently after our grandfather's death, I'd shown up demanding a piece of something I supposedly hadn't earned. It was a clean narrative, simple enough for anyone to believe if they didn't look too closely. To sell it, they'd lined up witnesses. A neighbor who'd known our family for years. A close friend of Emily's who swore she'd heard me say offhand at some holiday gathering years back that I didn't care what happened to the old house. An accountant who worked with my father's business and who spoke with the kind of rehearsed calm that told you he'd practiced this testimony more than once in front of a mirror. One after another, they took the stand and painted the same picture. Chloe wasn't around. Chloe didn't help. Chloe only showed up once there was something to gain. I sat there and took it. Not because it didn't sting, it did more than I wanted to admit, even to myself, but because I understood something they didn't. In a courtroom, the story that sounds good isn't the one that wins. The story that's documented is the one that wins. And I had spent months quietly gathering documentation while they'd spent months rehearsing a performance. My father at one point turned slightly toward the gallery and said loud enough for the judge to hear whether he meant it to carry or not, "All she's ever done is put on that uniform and expect the world to feel sorry for her." A ripple of laughter moved through a few rows behind us. Emily added her own line right after something about how without the uniform I wouldn't have anything to hide behind. More laughter. I kept my eyes on the table in front of me and let it pass over me the way you let weather pass over you when you're standing at attention and can't move regardless of what's falling. But I noticed the judge wasn't laughing. In fact, every time my service record came up in the paperwork, deployment dates, my duty assignments, the family liaison work I'd done for years, his eyes lingered on it longer than they needed to. Once he read a line twice, his brow tightening slightly, before looking back up and finding me across the room. He didn't say anything. He just looked. And that look stayed on me a beat longer than professional courtesy required. The opposing counsel didn't seem to notice, or if he did, he brushed it off the way people brush off things they don't have a category for. Maybe the judge just recognized me from somewhere. Maybe our paths had crossed at some community event. That's the story he must have told himself, because he kept moving forward with his questions like nothing unusual was happening in the room. I knew better. I'd learned a long time ago that when someone in a position of authority studies you like that, there's almost always history behind it, even if you can't immediately place where. I searched my memory during a short recess, running back through years of postings, memorial services, casualty notifications, family briefings, dozens of names and faces blurring together the way they do after enough time in that line of work. Nothing surfaced clearly, just a feeling quiet and persistent that I'd been in this man's life before in some capacity that mattered. When the court reconvened, and I was finally called to the stand, I walked up with my spine straight and my hands steady, the way I'd walked into far harder rooms than this one. I sat down, was sworn in, and waited for the first question. Instead, the judge leaned slightly forward, folded his hands, and looked at me with an expression that had nothing to do with legal procedure. "Colonel Miller," he said quietly. "Is he still doing well?" The room went silent in that particular way. Rooms go silent when something has shifted beneath the surface, and everyone can feel it even if they don't understand what it is. My father's lawyer glanced sideways at him, confused. Emily's expression flickered just slightly, uncertainty creeping into the corners of her composure for the first time all day. I nodded once. "He is, Your Honor. Thank you for asking." I didn't offer anything more, and the judge didn't ask anything more. But I saw Emily lean toward my father and whisper something, and for the first time since we'd walked into that courthouse, I watched my sister's confidence crack just slightly right down the middle. There's a reason that name landed the way it did, and to understand it, you have to go back several years to a place and a time. I don't talk about often because some memories don't get lighter with retelling, they just get quieter. Colonel Miller's son was a soldier under my care in the sense that mattered most in my line of work. He wasn't in my direct command, but he was part of the installation family I served. And when he was killed in action overseas, it fell to me to be the one who walked up that driveway in dress uniform, knocked on a door that had no idea what was coming, and delivered the kind of news that changes a family's shape forever. I remember the wind that day. I remember the exact color of the porch light still on from the night before, like the house itself hadn't caught up yet to what had happened in the world. Colonel Miller wasn't a colonel then, not in title. He was a father standing in his own doorway, and his wife was somewhere behind him. And I watched the two of them absorb the words, the way people absorb an impact all at once, and then in slow, delayed waves for weeks afterward. My job didn't end with that doorway. It was my job to walk with them through everything that came next, coordinating the return of their son's remains, standing beside them through a funeral with full military honors, sitting with them at a kitchen table for hours, going through paperwork neither of them could focus on because grief doesn't leave room for forms and signatures and dates. I stayed longer than my job technically required. I answered calls at 2 a.m. when the silence in that house became unbearable. I made sure nothing about the process added one more ounce of weight to two people already buried, under more than any parent should have to carry. I remember his wife months later holding my hand at their kitchen table and saying words I've never forgotten. "If you hadn't been there," she told me, "I don't think we would have made it through those first weeks at all." I didn't know what to say to that then, and I'm not sure I know what to say to it now. You don't do that work for gratitude. You do it because someone has to be steady when everyone else has the right not to be. I never expected to see either of them again. Their world and mine intersected in the worst week of their lives, and then the way these things go, our paths separated. I moved to new postings. Time passed. I assumed if I thought about it at all that Colonel Miller had simply become part of a chapter of my life that had closed the way most chapters eventually do. I never imagined he would end up on the bench in a county courtroom presiding over my own family's lawsuit against me. But here's the thing I want to be very clear about because it matters more than almost anything else in this story. Recognizing me didn't change how he ran that courtroom. Not for 1 second. From the moment the case resumed after that brief, quiet exchange, his tone shifted into something even more rigorous than before, if that was possible. He cut off interruptions immediately. He demanded precision from every attorney in the room. When my father's counsel tried to introduce a summary document instead of an original, the judge stopped him cold. "I don't work from summaries in a case involving property transfer and elder capacity," he said. His voice even almost bored the voice of a man who has heard every shortcut lawyers try to take and simply refuses all of them equally. "I want original documents. Bank records, not printouts described from memory. Signed originals, not typed transcriptions. If they don't exist, I want to know why they don't exist." My father's lawyer straightened his tie and said they would need a short recess to retrieve certain materials. The judge granted it without expression, without warmth, without anything that could be mistaken for favor. He simply noted the time on the record and called for a 15-minute break. I watched my father in that recess. I'd seen that particular tightness around his jaw before. Usually right before he lost an argument, he'd been certain he would win. He leaned toward Emily and said something low and sharp, and she nodded, but didn't look at him. Her eyes fixed instead on the folder of documents in front of her, like she was suddenly unsure what was actually inside it. I sat quietly at my own table, hands folded, and let myself think just for a moment about that kitchen table years ago, about a woman's hand gripping mine, about a father standing in a doorway not yet ready to understand what I'd come to tell him. I hadn't done any of that work expecting it to matter here in this room on this day. I'd done it because it was simply what needed doing. But sometimes the world circles back in ways you never anticipated, not to reward you exactly, but to remind you that decency has a way of outlasting the moment it was given in. When the recess ended and everyone filed back to their seats, the air in the room had changed. My father's confidence had thinned. Emily kept glancing toward the judge like she was trying to read something in his expression that wasn't there to read. And I understood, watching all of it unfold, that whatever came next in this case would be decided on exactly the terms Colonel Miller had just set. No shortcuts, no summaries, no room left for a story built on anything less than the truth. When the recess ended, my father's legal team returned with a thinner stack of paper than they'd started with, and I noticed my father's lawyer avoid his client's eyes as he sat back down. My own attorney, a quiet, methodical woman named Denise Park, who'd handled 3 deployments worth of my legal paperwork over the years, and had never once raised her voice in my presence, leaned toward me and said only, "Now we let the documents talk." I nodded. I'd learned a long time ago that the loudest person in a room is rarely the one who wins it. Denise didn't argue much. She didn't need to. Instead, she began presenting evidence one piece at a time in the unhurried, almost surgical way of someone who had spent months building something that could not be shaken loose by objection or theatrics. The first piece was email correspondence between my father and the estate attorney he'd hired months before my grandfather's death, correspondence that predated any claim of my supposed manipulation, correspondence that made clear the plan to consolidate assets under Emily's name had been discussed and structured well in advance. Then came text messages pulled from records the opposing side hadn't realized still existed on a secondary device, showing Emily herself acknowledging the transfer in casual, almost careless language, the kind of texting people do when they don't imagine a courtroom will ever read it back to them. Then came the security footage. A small law office 2 towns over the one that had drafted several of the transfer documents had kept its lobby camera running the entire time, as most offices do, without much thought given to who might one day request the footage. It showed my father in the waiting room on a date stamped clearly in the corner of the frame, going over paperwork with a clerk gesturing, pointing at Page's activity that directly contradicted his sworn claim that he'd had no direct involvement in preparing the documents in question. Then came the bank records. Wire confirmations, account restructuring forms, a paper trail stretching back further than either my father or Emily had accounted for in their version of events. I watched my father's face throughout all of this. It's a strange thing watching someone you've known your whole life try to hold an expression steady while the floor beneath his story quietly gives way plank by plank. He didn't crumble all at once. He adjusted his jaw. He crossed his arms. He glanced at his lawyer like he expected an objection to save him, and each time the objection either didn't come or didn't land. Then Denise called a witness neither side had anticipated. His name was Walter Boyd, a retired bank officer in his early 70s, who had worked at the branch handling my grandfather's accounts for over 2 decades. He walked to the stand slowly, deliberately, the way older men walk when they've decided something matters enough to show up for, even though it would be easier not to. He testified that months before my grandfather passed, he had personally declined to process one of the account restructuring requests my father submitted, citing concerns about the account holder's clarity of consent during the in-person meeting. He said my father had pushed back hard, had come in more than once trying to get the transaction processed through a different officer, and that he, Walter, had eventually reported the pressure to his branch manager before retiring shortly after. I didn't want to get involved in a family's business. Walter said, his voice steady, despite his age, despite the slight tremor that comes with it. But I've thought about that day for 2 years. I couldn't sit home and watch this happen to that man's memory without saying something. The room was very quiet after that. Emily's composure, which had already been thinning since the recess, began to come apart in visible pieces. Her answers on cross-examination started to shift. First, she claimed she hadn't known about the early account discussions, then confronted with her own texts. She claimed she'd known but hadn't understood the implications, then confronted again. She claimed she'd trusted our father's judgment entirely and hadn't asked questions she now wished she had. 3 different versions of the same story, each one collapsing slightly further than the last. The judge noted each contradiction without comment, without visible reaction, simply writing in his folder with the same even hand he'd used all day. Then came the moment I still think about more than any other in that entire trial. Denise introduced a voice recording legally obtained, properly disclosed in advance, admissible without objection, pulled from a business call my father had made to his own accountant months earlier, a call he clearly hadn't thought would ever resurface. His voice filled that courtroom, tinny through the small speaker, but unmistakably his. "Chloe's off playing soldier somewhere," the recording said. "She'll never even notice." The silence that followed wasn't the ordinary silence of a courtroom pausing between arguments. It was the silence of an entire room recalibrating, of people who had laughed at me in the hallway that morning, suddenly reconsidering what exactly they'd been laughing at. My father stared straight ahead, refusing to look at me, refusing to look at anyone. Emily's hands were folded so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had gone pale. I didn't feel triumphant hearing it. I felt something quieter and heavier, a kind of sorrow, the specific sorrow of hearing confirmed in your father's own voice, something you'd suspected but had hoped right up until the very last second wasn't true. After the recording finished playing, Denise let the silence sit for a moment before she moved forward, and I think that pause did more work than any argument could have. Then she turned to a part of the case I hadn't fully realized she'd been building until that exact moment. She stood, walked to her table, and lifted a thick binder I recognized but hadn't seen assembled quite like this before. Inside it was my full service record laid out alongside something else entirely, years of personal financial documentation I'd handed over to her months earlier without much explanation, because at the time I hadn't understood how it would matter. Your Honor, she said, opposing counsel has spent this trial arguing that my client abandoned her family. I'd like to show the court what actually happened during the years in question. What followed took nearly 40 minutes, and I sat there and listened to my own life read back to me in a way I'd never heard it described before, because I'd never once thought to describe it that way myself. Leave requests dated and approved, timed around my grandfather's medical appointments years before his death. Flight records showing repeated trips home sometimes for only 36 hours, at a stretch taken during periods when I was stationed halfway across the world and had to burn through leave I could have used for anything else. Hospital co-pay receipts, dozens of them spanning years, all in my name. Property tax payments on the old house made quietly, consistently long before anyone imagined there would ever be a dispute over who owned it. Insurance premiums. A folder of handwritten notes from my grandfather's doctor's office thanking the granddaughter who calls to check on billing every month, even from overseas. I remember watching those documents get read into the record one by one, feeling something strange happen in my chest. Not pride exactly, but something close to it, mixed with a grief I hadn't expected to surface in a courtroom. I hadn't kept those receipts to prove anything. I'd kept them because that's simply what you do when you're the one who shows up. I never imagined a judge would one day hold them up as evidence of who I actually was, as opposed to who my family had spent months describing me as. The detail that seemed to land hardest, though the one that visibly shifted something in the room, was the medical spending. Because it wasn't my father's name on those receipts. It wasn't Emily's. Every single payment tied to my grandfather's care in his final years traced back to me, a soldier stationed thousands of miles away, sending money home not because anyone asked me to, but because nobody else was doing it. I watched Emily's face when that detail was read aloud. She didn't say anything. She stared down at her hands, and for the first time all day, she looked less like a woman fighting for an inheritance, and more like someone quietly reckoning with a story she'd told herself for a very long time, one that apparently hadn't been entirely true. My father sat very still. I've seen that stillness in him before, usually right before he says something designed to end a conversation rather than continue it. But this time nothing came. He simply stared straight ahead, jaw tight, refusing to meet my eyes even once as the documents kept coming. The judge, for his part, remained composed through nearly all of it, writing steadily, asking the occasional clarifying question in the same even tone he'd used since morning. But when Denise finished and sat back down, he took a moment before speaking, longer than any pause he'd allowed himself all day. He looked over his glasses at my father, and when he finally spoke, his voice had lost none of its neutrality, but it had gained something harder underneath it. "Mr. Evans," he said, "you came into my courtroom today and told a very different story than the one these documents are telling me." My father didn't answer. There wasn't really an answer to give. The judge continued addressing the room now, rather than any one person specifically. "I want to be clear about something. This court does not decide cases based on uniforms or reputations, or which family member speaks more confidently in a hallway. This court decides cases based on evidence. And the evidence in front of me paints a very specific picture of who provided care, who provided support, and who did not." Nobody in the gallery laughed anymore. Nobody whispered. The same people who had chuckled at my father's comment about me playing soldier that morning now sat in a silence that felt almost embarrassed, like the air itself had realized it had been on the wrong side of a joke. I didn't look at my father. I didn't look at Emily. I kept my eyes forward the way I'd been taught to keep them forward through every hard room I'd ever had to sit in, and I let the truth simply exist in the space we'd all just filled with it, without needing me to add anything more. The final phase of the trial moved faster than I expected, the way things often do once the weight of truth finally outpaces the weight of a story built to hide it. There were no more surprises after that. No more recordings, no more last-minute witnesses. Just the slow, careful process of a judge working through everything that had been placed in front of him methodically, without a trace of the personal history he and I shared, showing anywhere in his tone. He went through the evidence out loud for the record the way judges do when they want every word of a decision to survive an appeal untouched. He cited the email correspondence predating my grandfather's death. He cited the bank records, the security footage, Walter Boyd's testimony, the shifting statements Emily had given under cross-examination. He cited the recorded call, noting for the record that it had been properly obtained and lawfully admitted, closing off in advance any argument that it shouldn't have been considered. Then he moved to my own documentation, the leave records, the flights, the medical payments, the property taxes, and said simply that it established a clear and consistent pattern of care that directly contradicted the narrative the plaintiffs, my own father and sister, had presented to the court. I watched him work through it with the same flat, careful tone throughout, and I understood listening to him that this was exactly why he'd been able to look at me the way he had that morning and still run this trial with total fairness. He hadn't let recognition become favor. He'd simply let it exist quietly beside the facts, and then he'd let the facts decide everything. When he reached his ruling, he read it slowly, like he wanted every word to land exactly where it needed to. The transfers my father had orchestrated were voided in full, ruled the product of undue influence, and in at least 2 instances direct misrepresentation to financial institutions. Ownership of the property and the remaining investment accounts was restored according to the original terms of my grandfather's will, split evenly between Emily and me exactly as he had intended before anyone tried to rewrite what he'd left behind. Emily was ordered to return the portion of assets she'd received beyond her rightful share, along with damages tied to the cost of litigation my father and sister had forced me into defending against. My father was assessed the full court costs of the case. And then, in a tone that dropped even flatter than before, the judge noted that certain elements of the documentation, specifically discrepancies in signature verification on 2 of the transfer forms, would be referred to the appropriate investigative authority for further review. My father stood up so fast his chair scraped hard against the floor. "This is only happening because you know her," he said, his voice cracking, pointing at me like the accusation itself might undo everything that had just been read into the record. "You've had it out for me since the second you saw her name on this docket." The room went still in a different way than it had all day. Not the stillness of shock, but the stillness of everyone waiting to see how a judge responds to being accused in his own courtroom, of exactly the kind of bias he'd spent the entire day proving he didn't have. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't even seem particularly moved by the accusation the way a man isn't moved by an argument he's already heard and already answered for himself. "No," he said simply. He let that single word sit in the air for a moment before continuing. "I remember your daughter, Mr. Evans, because years ago she helped my family through the worst day of our lives. I have never forgotten that. And I never will. But that has nothing to do with the ruling I just issued." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice had gained a weight I hadn't heard from him all day. "I ruled today on the evidence in front of me. Bank records don't care who I remember. Signatures don't care who visited my family in a hospital corridor a decade ago. I would have reached this same conclusion if I had never met your daughter a day in my life, because the documents in this case leave no room for any other conclusion." He looked at my father a moment longer, and something almost gentler crossed his face before it hardened again into the professional neutrality he'd carried since morning. "You told this court a story today," he said. "The evidence told me a different one. I'm required to believe the evidence. Nobody in that room said anything after that?" My father sat back down slowly, the fight visibly draining out of him in a way I genuinely never witnessed before. Not once in 33 years of watching him win every argument he'd ever started. Emily stared at the table in front of her, her hands still folded, her composure gone entirely, now replaced by something that looked almost like grief. Grief. I imagined not just for the money, but for the version of the story she'd apparently convinced herself was true. I sat very still in my chair, hands folded the same way they'd been folded all day, and let the ruling settle over me the way relief settles over a body that has been braced for impact for far too long. The courtroom emptied slowly, the way rooms do after something heavy has happened in them, everyone moving a little more carefully than they had walking in. I stayed in my seat for a moment after the judge stepped down, not because I needed to, but because I wanted one quiet minute before I had to become someone's daughter again, someone's sister again out there in the hallway, where none of this would be settled by a ruling. My father didn't look at me on his way out. He walked past with his lawyer at his elbow, murmuring something I couldn't hear and didn't try to. Emily lingered a moment longer, and for just a second I thought she might say something to me, some fragment of an apology or an excuse, the way people sometimes reach for words when the silence gets too uncomfortable to bear alone. She didn't. She just looked at me, tired in a way I'd never seen on her before, and then she followed our father out the door. In the weeks that followed, the family I'd grown up in came apart in ways that had nothing to do with courtrooms anymore. Emily, once the paperwork and repayments were finalized, was left with almost nothing close to what she'd once believed was hers. My father, facing the court costs and the mounting pressure of the fraud referral hanging over him, ended up selling the house he'd fought so hard to keep entirely out of my name. I heard about it secondhand, the way you hear about most things. Once a family has truly split apart, a mutual acquaintance, a passing comment, nothing direct because there was no direct line left between us anymore. I want to be honest about something because I think it matters more than the verdict itself. Nobody watching that trial walked away thinking I'd been vindicated in some triumphant way. There was no cheering, no moment where I stood outside the courthouse and felt like I'd won something worth celebrating. Mostly I just felt tired and sad, in the particular way you feel sad when the truth finally comes out, but it costs you nearly everything to get there, including the last thin thread connecting you to people who used to be your whole world. I didn't gloat, I didn't call to rub it in, didn't post anything, didn't spend one single afternoon feeling superior to the two people who had spent months trying to convince a judge I'd manipulated a dying man for money. I simply took back what was legally, rightfully mine, filed the paperwork Denise sent over, and tried to figure out what to do with a piece of my family's history that no longer had any family left standing around it in one piece. A few months later, I sold the old house. I want to be clear that this wasn't easy. I stood in that front hallway one last time before the closing, and I let myself remember my grandfather the way I actually wanted to remember him, not through the lens of a lawsuit, not through the sound of my father's voice on that recording, but through smaller things. The smell of coffee on the porch in the mornings, the sound of his voice telling stories about his own years in uniform, stories I used to think were just bedtime tales, until I got old enough to understand he'd lived every word of them. I stood there a long time before I finally locked the door for the last time. With the proceeds, I did something I'd actually been thinking about since long before the trial ever started. I established a scholarship fund in my grandfather's name, specifically for children of military families facing financial hardship, the kind of quiet, practical help he would have wanted far more than any headline or courtroom victory. It felt like the only ending that made sense. Not revenge, not triumph, just his name attached to something that would keep helping people long after all of us in that courtroom were gone. I think about Colonel Miller sometimes, too. I never went out of my way to speak with him again after the trial ended because I understood better than most people would exactly how important it was for him that his fairness that day never be mistaken for favoritism. But I've thought often about what it must have felt like for him sitting on that bench, looking down and recognizing the woman who once stood in his doorway on the worst day of his life, and then choosing deliberately to let the evidence speak louder than the memory. That's not something everyone is capable of. I respect him more for that restraint than I could ever put into words. One morning, not long after everything was finally settled, I put my uniform on again and drove out to my grandfather's grave. I stood there in the quiet the way I used to stand at attention long before any of this trial ever happened, and I set down a small bundle of flowers at the base of his headstone. "You used to tell me," I said quietly, "that the truth always moves slower than a lie. But it gets there eventually." I stood a moment longer, then turned and walked back to my car, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, I didn't feel like I was carrying anything heavy with me at all. I want to know where you think a story like this really ends, because in real life, it doesn't always end in the courtroom. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight, and if this story moved you even a little, share it with someone who needs to hear that the truth, even when it takes its time, still finds its way home. We've got so many more stories like this one to bring you, so subscribe if you don't want to miss what's coming next. Let's keep this journey going together.